Okay, since 1992, the Christian persecution watchdog group Open Doors USA has annually published its World Watch List, an extensive report ranking the top 50 countries where persecution and discrimination of Christ followers is most severe. And I will tell you, it is a well-documented, well-researched report, which I use both here at the Family Research Council, and it's one that I even look at as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Well, earlier today, Open Doors released its 2022 World Watch List, and the data, they say, presents the biggest ranking shakeup in the World Watch List history. That's significant. Joining me now to tell us what their latest extensive on-the-ground research has revealed is Open Doors USA CEO, my good friend Dr. David Curry, who hosts today's report release. Dr. Curry, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
All right. I'm afraid once we get into this, I may not stop. So before we jump into it, briefly tell our viewers and listeners how they can get a copy of this list.
Well, opendoorsusa.org has the stories, the data, the prayer list on how you can pray for these various countries. It really describes each individual context, because when you look at these 50 countries, some of them are Islamic regimes, others are democracies. Sometimes it's a squeeze where people are slowly having their rights cut off. It's like a strangulation. And then other times it's like a bomb went off. Sometimes literally it's like a major smash. So we really measure across 6 different spheres of life. What's it like for the individual? What's it like on the national level? What's the violence level? And so I think it's a great resource for people who either want to pray through it, want to preach their way through it. We have sermon outlines, all manner of things, so that Christians and others can be informed about what's happening to the body of Christ and what's happening to religious freedom for all people everywhere. Because it's really, I think, the canary in the coal mine. When you see what happens to Christians, it's usually a tipping point for other chaos that's going to reach into economic, into terrorism, into other issues that we will face in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. What we have found globally is that where you have religious freedom, you have greater social stability, economic activity, which then is less of a problem for the rest of the world. Now, as you talk about those 6 sectors, before we get into the list, in terms of the research you do, you actually have people on the ground in many of these places. So you're getting information. Now, this is not just a compilation of news sources. You're gaining firsthand information as to what's happening on the ground in these countries.
This is a grassroots study. It begins with Christians in each of these regions, and then we have researchers and surveys we do at a higher level, and then we analyze it, we sort it for people so that others can look at it as well. We present it to the State Department, to other researchers, but it has to start at the grassroots level. Too many of these studies start with people who are bishops and cardinals, and they're living somewhere other than the place where the impact is happening. And we want to know how we can support Christians on the ground in places like Afghanistan and North Korea and Somalia, India, all the countries on the World Watch List. So you got to start with the grassroots.
Now, in 20 years, this is the biggest shakeup you've said this year that you've seen in the list. Explain. Well,
North Korea has been at the top of the World Watch List because here you have a communist system, a dictator. They control all the means that make life possible: your economy, your food, the borders, the police, neighborhood watches. It's old school Soviet communist system, but with all the modern sort of tools available. So North Korea has been at the top. Now, all of a sudden, for the first time in 20 years, we have a new player on the scene at the top of the list. Afghanistan is number 1. And what has happened is that Afghanistan had been number 2 for many years, sometimes moving to number 3, and Somalia coming up on the list. This is a list of perpetrators. There's no honor in this list. But what has happened since August is that the Taliban has made a concerted effort to track prominent Christian leaders, to try to uncover the network of Christians that exist within the country. Some Christians have fled. We all know that story, and thankful for those who've helped to make that happen. But some exist, and I think that's salt and light in that community, those that are brave enough to stay, and yet they're being tracked. So I think it's safe to say we believe that every Christian who's still in Afghanistan, and there are thousands and thousands of them, are either in hiding or on the run. And that has raised Afghanistan to #1 on the world watch list.
I mean, David, isn't that a clear example of where U.S. foreign policy has an implication for religious freedom and the persecution of Christians?
It clearly does. It's hard to imagine how we overlook this. Afghanistan was #2 because the Taliban controlled about 70% of the country, even up until their takeover of the government. And we know what they were doing in those regions, these rural areas. Many people were fleeing the Taliban to come into Kabul and others for relative freedom. It wasn't great in Kabul. Everybody knows that story. But it went from a city of 500,000 people to 5 million people because they were fleeing the Taliban. So to imagine that we thought in some scenario that they were going to be fair and equal-handed rulers in these major cities is laughable and really quite unbelievable. So
Right,
what's
'cause
happened since then is they're tracking people.
we knew what was happening in those areas where they had control, and they were an entity that had control over, as you said, a large portion of the country. So this should be no surprise as to what they're doing now that they have control over everything.
One of the takeaways has got to be that we've got to see what happens when we allow countries like this, I'm not just saying the United States, but free Western countries who believe in freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. When we let countries and regions fall into chaos, you have so many ripple effects. If you look at the top of the watch list, you have Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Eritrea. These are all largely failed states which are totally in chaos, and they are the launching grounds of terrorism around the world. This study focuses on religious freedom, particularly for Christians, but it does have implications for everybody else as well.
So, David, beyond the shakeup with Afghanistan becoming #1 in terms of persecution of Christians, what other surprises did you see in this year's research?
Well, one of the takeaways, and we've talked about this in previous years, is this expansion of jihadi terrorism in the African belt, what's called the Sahel region, that middle belt across the African continent. There's a clash of civilizations going on there, and its epicenter is Nigeria, the north of Nigeria, 13 Sharia law states. And we have been saying for years, it looks like it's going to become very familiar to us, like ISIS when they took over Iraq and Syria. You now have major issues in Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso. These are all rising on the list. It's the same problem. You have the Fulani extremists, you have Boko Haram, ISIS related, and they are targeting Christians. Now, in some outlets, you'll hear people say, well, the Fulani are herdsmen. They're just ancient farmers. This is not the case. They have an ideology. They're not targeting everybody. They're targeting Christians who are living in villages or towns together. They're burning these down. They're kidnapping women. They're kidnapping children. 1,000 children in Nigeria kidnapped last year, Christian children, 1,000. By Boko Haram or the Fulani. So this is a major issue, and it's now bleeding over into what they view as a caliphate, what we see as a massive regional issue that is going to continue to grow unless Nigeria and these central governments quickly get a hold and try to find a way to protect churches, these soft targets, these Christian villages which are being targeted. We know where they're going to try to attack.
Right.
Why will the Nigerian government not step up and support with their military and police? It's a question we need answers to.
And this is another example of U.S. foreign policy in which Nigeria had previously, under the previous administration, been recognized or designated as a country of particular concern because of the persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. The government, ignoring that. Now, this administration removing that. First time ever we've seen a country that was on that list of country of particular concerns being completely removed from the list in the over 20 years that's been a part of the State Department. That has the potential, as you said, to spill over beyond Nigeria, and with that being the most populous country in Africa, what eventually could happen on the African continent?
Well, I mean, there are major resources, both human resources and economic resources in that region. What you're going to see is you have a very young population demographically in the African continent and in these key cities. You have massive corruption. You have a strengthening terrorist groups. This is going to be a major problem. They're going to have continued success in recruiting young people. They're going to take on mafia-like enterprises, taking over key resources of the region. And you're going to have a very similar case where this becomes a global threat. And I'm afraid we're already at that tipping point. I hope not, but we need to do something soon.
Let's turn now to China. They continue to be on the list. Where does China fall on your watch list?
Well, China's number 17 on our list, and that's not because their threat is to be diminished. The violence, the outward violence is not the same as you might see in Nigeria, but they have the most sophisticated system of persecution. And I describe it as a high-tech noose. It's like it's slowly choking. Since President Xi consolidated his power, he's found a way to use technology, surveillance. They're watching, centralizing all of the cameras in every place you go. They're centralizing that information. They're not having just eyes and ears on what happens. They're using artificial intelligence so that it knows when Tony goes to church. And then therefore they're lowering your score. This we knew. But every year they continue to add new layers to it. And it's just choking and choking and choking a faith experience in China. So they shrink the churches, they force them to break up into small groups, then they force them to go online, then they monitor them online, then they shut down their online experiences. We think 80%, we estimate that 80% of the churches who met in commercial buildings are now forced into small groups and forced online, and then they are monitored. And they are always shut down if it's more than a couple of dozen people. So this is like this continued diminishment. Then they add new laws just a few weeks ago, as you know, your viewers probably are aware as well, where they now have made it so that nobody can sell a Bible online unless they agree to let the Chinese Communist Party censor that Bible. Soon 100 million Christians, Tony, will only have access to Bibles that the Chinese government has either edited or approved. And you can imagine I can't imagine that people of faith would not be horrified by that thought. Right. This
David,
is the choking that's happening.
Almost out of time. I got to ask you this final question for our viewers, our listeners. What can Christians in the United States be doing to help our brothers and sisters?
We have to be people of prayer. Secondly, we have to be people who learn the lessons. Data is important. It's the next battlefield. Let's see what's happening with China, but let's learn when these big four data companies want to cut off preachers. Where do you post your sermons? All these questions are going to come to you on your front door. So let's step up and speak out for the rights of people everywhere, whether it's online or in person, to meet in community as followers of Jesus. I think that's important. Share these stories. We know that we can't stop persecution, but we must speak out for people who don't have a voice and help them where we can. There are projects, there are things we can do. We have to be united about this in a way that we haven't been before.
100% agree, and we fully support the work of Open Doors USA. David, doing a great job. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony.
And folks,